This year, majority Democrats in the Washington legislature made police accountability a top issue, and they passed a series of sweeping measures addressing everything from when police can use force, give chase, or sick a dog on a suspect, to who investigates when police use deadly force. Minority Republicans were generally opposed to these measures, and since they took effect, police and others have warned of unintended consequences. Meanwhile, Democrats say their work isn't done yet, and more reforms are likely. So what's on the agenda for the 2022 session, and what so-called fixes to the new laws are being contemplated? Joining me now is Democrat Roger Goodman, chair of the House Public Safety Committee, and Gina Mosbrucker, the ranking Republican on that committee. Welcome, both of you, back to Inside Olympia. Good to see you.
Great.
It's good to see you. Yes.
I'd like to start with just a brief top-line response to what you're hearing from law enforcement, from community members and others to these police reform bills. I don't need a lengthy dissertation here, but just top-line reaction. And let's start with you, Representative Goodman, as the chair of the committee.
Thanks, Austin. Yes, in general, really, by and large, the police agencies, police chiefs, sheriffs, particularly in my area, are saying we agree with what the legislature has done to reduce the needless use of force, needless injuries and deaths, to improve the relationship between police and the community, to make sure that police are treating all communities equitably, and that the current training we have for police is what the legislation sort of reaffirmed and codified, and existing policies in police agencies are also reaffirmed and codified. However, there are some ambiguities that inevitably, with a major package of legislation like this, you're going to need to clarify and refine the law. So in the upcoming session, we'll be doing that. And those ambiguities have raised concerns and confusion and questions. And so I'm working very closely with the police and other first responders to make sure we know exactly what we need to do to give them the certainty that they need. And Representative Mosbrucker and I are also working in a collaborative way to make sure that we have that certainty. We're really trying not to politicize public safety here. This is something that we're all interested in.
And we'll get into much more detail about what you are contemplating for next session. Representative Mosbrucker, your top line, what you're hearing, your takeaway at this point early on in the implementation of these laws.
Thank you very much for that question. What we're hearing after touring through the state of Washington, not just in our district, is that police are fine with reform and they're fine with doing better. All of us are, but that these laws and packages of bills that came through last session went too far. And there's so many unintended consequences that they have to be fixed immediately to keep the public safe. So we're hearing a bit of the opposite. And I think, like the chair said, we're going to work together to fix it.
Before we dive much deeper, I do want you to hear what the chief of the Washington State Patrol said this week when he appeared before the Joint Transportation Committee and was asked, I believe, by State Representative Jim Walsh, who's a Republican, about, this was in the context of the lack of diversity in the State Patrol, but then questions were asked and the chief made mention of the challenge that he's losing troopers as fast as he can hire them. He listed a number of concerns, but they included these police reforms. Here's what he had to say.
The atmosphere associated with the profession, you've got a lot of folks who have decided that they want out because they're fearful of being prosecuted and losing everything that they have. And you have spouses who are telling spouses that they want them out. So
you heard him there saying that troopers and some of their spouses are concerned about being prosecuted. Representative Goodman, what's your response to that?
Well, policing is a tough profession to begin with, highly stressful. They run into the danger for us. And on top of that, in the last several years, police have really been embattled in the public eye. Cell phone cameras have been able to capture across the country some really questionable and troubling incidents. And that's led to legislation across the country. And so they're on the defensive. And I can imagine that some police who are nearing retirement age would probably want to hang it up. I have, however, met quite a number of the new recruits coming into the basic law enforcement academy who are excited about their jobs, and they have a sort of a different sense of justice and their role in the community. So it's mixed, but yeah, I'll acknowledge that it's really tough for law enforcement today. And that's why in enacting this legislation, it really, I don't believe, was one-sided. We're trying to uphold the profession and give them the support they need. At the same time, make sure that communities feel safe and that communities and police improve their relationship.
Representative Mosbrucker, I can imagine some community members who advocated for these changes might say, look, if some officers are going to leave the profession because they don't think they can operate under these new rules, then good riddance. They don't belong in the profession, and that it is time for a new generation and a new way of thinking about policing to come to the fore. Again, thinking, reflecting on what the chief just said, but also what the marginalized communities that have been over-policed historically have said about the changes that need to happen. How would you respond to what the chief said?
I think that the chief is correct to be extremely concerned. I think that we had a shortage in law enforcement prior to all of this, prior to the vaccine, prior to pandemic, state of emergency. And it's one thing to have other occupations labor shortage. I own and operate businesses. I see it all the time. But when you have law enforcement, those that keep the community safe, it's not acceptable. And we have to do everything we can to build those up and to recruit and to make sure that those who have that institutional knowledge and that experience, who are willing to be trained, who are willing to change and reform, but for them to leave is devastating to the state of Washington. Without safety in our communities, nothing else matters. It's very alarming.
There was a lot of talk during that Joint Transportation Commission meeting about recruiting the next generation of, in this particular case, state troopers and diversifying the state patrol. Again, the context of that conversation was the lack of diversity in the patrol. It's something that I've reported on recently for public radio, along with Mike Riker of the Seattle Times. So we're at a time when policing is having to change. We're at a time when agencies are not as diverse as they need to be to reflect the diversity and growing diversity of the state, and at a time where it's perhaps even harder to recruit people into the profession. And again, this is sort of a 30,000-foot view question, but I'd like to hear from both of you. Where do you, and we're going to get back to the specifics of some of these reforms, but where do you think we're headed? And especially, what would the message be? What should the message be for police departments today who are trying to get people to sign up for this career? Representative Goodman?
Well, again, we are trying through the legislation we passed to professionalize police even more than they already are, and to reaffirm the very progressive policies that we have in this state in terms of the training, to focus on de-escalation and where a use of force is the last option, and to treat communities, in a fair manner. One thing we might not realize is that we're actually trying to make the jobs of police easier by relieving them of the responsibility of solving all of society's problems. The mental health crisis really belongs with mental health professionals and the behavioral health system. Homelessness, racism itself. There's so many problems that we drop at the jailhouse door and ask police to solve for us. And so part of the reforms that we've enacted are a part of a transition to give police the responsibility that they were trained for and relieve them of so many other responsibilities that they've had to take on. And so it's not just these new laws to make sure that they're accountable for misconduct and so forth, but it's part of a transformation of public safety and just taking care of the community in many ways.
Representative Mosbrucker, the same question to you, just about, could you, in good conscience today, encourage people to apply to be police officers in Washington State, or would you say go find another state to work in?
Well, I would hope that they would work in Washington State, but I understand their concern. I understand, they don't know if they get to come home at the end of the night, where I think you and I probably feel pretty safe that we'll be able to do that. We have to figure out tools to incentivize them to come back in. I think the frustrating part for us is that not all officers are bad, right? Not all doctors, teachers, legislators, or TV anchors are bad. But this legislation was overreaching in that it covered all of the officers in the state of Washington. We want those who are bad actors that break the law to absolutely be 100% accountable for their actions. So trying to find that balance to tell that story. And I feel like, and I've always felt like, we need to support law enforcement more. We need to pay them more. We need to give them all the support that we can, because their job has always been diverse, just as the good chairman said. But at the same time, without having enough mental health counselors or crisis responders to come in to take over that role, and without them being safe while they're doing their job in a secure crime scene, it's really concerning. I think I would encourage law enforcement to work in the state of Washington once these fixes are back in again, where they have protections to do their job.
And so let's talk about some of those so-called fixes. And I just want to remind the audience, I alluded a little bit to this in the introduction, but there were a package of bills, a dozen or so. They included a sweeping police tactics bill that banned chokeholds and neck holds, banned no-knock warrants, very much limited high-speed pursuits. There was a reasonable care standard that was put into place regarding use of force, and really a requirement to de-escalate whenever and however possible and use the least amount of physical force necessary. A requirement that the state create a new independent office of police investigations to investigate police incidents of deadly force. And the governor just this week announced the advisory panel that will oversee that office. A bill to make it easier to decertify police officers, create a statewide use of force database, some reforms around Brady lists, which are when officers have been untruthful, and prosecutors need to know about that for purposes of when they testify in court, and making it easier to sue agencies over deadly force encounters. Representative Goodman, as you think about some of the changes, and I think they sometimes call these trailer bills, I don't want the laundry list. Can you just start with the number one thing that's on your mind that you think you'll do coming out of the gates?
Yeah, first of all, you didn't even mention all of the bill. It was a really sweeping set of reforms, right? So we did a lot, creating an affirmative duty for officers to report the misconduct of others and intervene when they see excessive force, requiring that juveniles have access to an attorney when being interrogated by the police, requiring that all interrogations being recorded, and more. So in the context of everything that we did, we've only identified just a few issues. So frankly, I think we did pretty well with a massive package of reform like that. And as I said, it's inevitable that we have these so-called trailer bills to clarify and refine. I'd say there are 3 or 4 issues. First is mental health crisis. The officers have been very hesitant to physically interact, to put hands on when trying to help people who are in crisis, because that's technically a use of force. So they're afraid that that might be considered excessive and they can get in trouble, either of civil liability or maybe be sanctioned by the state. Other similar circumstances, taking juveniles into protective custody when they've run away, removing abused children from abusive households, things like that. These are not criminal.
These are civil matters.
Exactly. These are not criminal matters.
And these are situations where a social worker for the state or a designated mental health provider might call the police, and this is tradition, to say, I need backup here. This could become a dangerous situation for me. It's a civil detainer matter. I might need you to do the transport. Traditionally, police have done that, and now they're saying, whoa, we're not sure we'll even show up, much less do the transport anymore.
Yeah, so we were not explicit enough that those other laws, those other statutes, which we did not amend and we didn't intend to, the Involuntary Treatment Act, for instance, is the most important regarding mental health crisis. That you can do the great work you did before, and so we want to make it, and we are already preparing language.
So how will you do that? What will you tell them? What's the change?
Oh, all we have to do is make explicit reference to those laws, saying that they can continue to use reasonable force. Force sounds like you're hurting somebody. They're actually trying to help someone here, but again, the physical interaction is what they're afraid of, and as long as we list that statute and the standards within it, they're fine. And so we've had a number of meetings, and we're very, very close to consensus on this. And I don't think that's going to be very contentious at all.
Well, and before you move on to another topic, then, Representative Mosbrucker, let me have you weigh in here. is this, and the chair said you guys have been in communication and trying to work together. Is this, clearly this is an issue that's been identified. Are you comfortable with where things are headed in terms of trying to clarify the language in that particular use of force bill?
Certainly, I think that we just want to see the language. We have a package of bills back to respond to make sure the community stays safe. And so we may not need to run those if the chair and his team are able to come up with those same answers we have, but we need to see that language before we move forward. We want to make sure that those fixes are done immediately regarding, in some cases, for example, domestic violence, child custody, you've got the ability to use reasonable suspicion versus probable cause. Vehicle pursuits, traveling, chasing someone in a manslaughter whose case and having to stop because you didn't see the crime, that's not acceptable. Making sure that the mental health pieces where all first responders can come to a scene to help the community versus just one crisis responder on her own or his own in order to deal with a situation which likely can escalate, or under the influence in State v. Blake, under the influence of really hard drugs, fentanyl, heroin. We have to keep those who are protecting us, EMS, safe while they do their jobs. And I don't think this was intended by the chair or his team. I think that this just has to be fixed immediately, because in the meantime, we have officers who were told not to respond. And that can't be more alarming than that.
And I'm seeing statistics that show that the number of involuntary treatment commitments has dropped pretty significantly in the state since these took effect. Representative Goodman, I know you have a list in your mind, and I don't want to interrupt that train of thought, but since Representative Mosbrucker brought up the question of pursuits, I am curious whether that's on the list as well. I realize you don't want to legislate by anecdote, but there have been stories about pursuits not, there was a case I think in Puyallup that has been in the media where police did not pursue a driver who apparently rammed two unoccupied police cars at an apartment complex. I heard about a case here in Thurston County where they didn't give chase, and then ultimately the person ran into another car on the freeway and that car flipped over. And I have heard frustration from police officers that they think that this is too stringent. So let's talk about pursuits for a moment.
Yeah, so again, we wanted to make sure that we understand the civil matter, the non-criminal matter, so mental health crisis, helping protect children and so forth, making sure that police can enforce or execute court orders, helping fire and EMS on the scene, performing life-saving measures, the sort of community caretaking function. We're going to make all that clear. I did give to Representative Mosbrucker yesterday the language, all of that. Now, you're talking about criminal matters where there's a need to investigate particularly serious crimes where people have been hurt or killed. We did set a high bar that they can't use force unless there's probable cause that the individual committed the offense. And you have to have a lot of information for that. Reasonable suspicion is the threshold below that. And so that's what we're looking at, is allowing for the use of force. And the use of force can't be excessive because we've now legislated how much force can be used. To be able to use reasonable force, something below probable cause, but reasonable suspicion that the person, not completely vague information about an individual. And so that's something we're definitely looking at.
Is that specific to pursuits or more broadly?
Well, there's two issues with regard to whether reasonable suspicion is enough to do it or whether probable cause needs to be enough. One is pursuits, vehicle pursuits, which there's a lot of concern about vehicle pursuits. In my area, we have like no pursuit policy or a no pursuit policy. We are a congested, highly populated area with a lot of traffic where they don't even pursue DUIs. And so in the Puget Sound area, there's very few pursuits. But we do need to take a look at that as well, of whether, someone has committed a serious offense and they're fleeing the scene. Should police be able to engage in a vehicle pursuit? But engaging in that balancing test, that is the pursuit going to endanger the pursuit itself, going to endanger the public, on the roadway, more than what the risk of what the individual did, right? So that's something we have to take a look at. But with regard to the use of force, it's the same issue. Can the use of force, like tackling someone who is fleeing, be used when there's only reasonable suspicion rather than that higher level of probable cause where there's really certainty about that being the individual who committed the crime. That in particular is what I believe we need to adjust, and particularly domestic violence. Domestic violence and mental health, that's what police deal with all day, right? Those are their calls. And a domestic violence call, show up and you don't know who did what for a few minutes, and you need to investigate it. And that's only reasonable suspicion. You don't know, who hit whom and who choked whom and who scratched whom and so forth. And so during that period when there's only reasonable suspicion, there is a need to physically restrain people, prevent them from fleeing or maybe going into the house where there might be a weapon and so forth, and then investigating to find out, to the level of probable cause who did what. And so domestic violence is what I'm most concerned about, to give police the tools they need physically to restrain people and to engage with them, to keep the scene safe before they determine, what exactly happened.
Representative Mosbrucker.
Well, I think we're just trying to move forward. We're trying to sort through everything that we felt like went too far. I do appreciate the communication whenever it happens with the chair in order to fix these things. We have to listen to the people who've been affected by these crimes. And I think that we need to do more of that. I think it's really important to make sure that there's so many pieces that we felt like went too far and we couldn't stop. There was some movement and compromise during session, but it was really tough at the end of the day because law enforcement paid the price. And we have amazing law enforcement officers who are deciding to leave the profession, not just retire out, but decide that it's just not worth it. And that breaks my heart because they came into an occupation to serve and to be part of their community, and to the community policing piece. We were moving forward, I feel like, on really great things. And then when we got hit with these bills, it left a disaster. It left a place where many law enforcement officers were saying, we just can't do it. The spouses, like Chief Batiste said, are saying, please leave into another career, even if it's less money and you don't get to do the job you love. And that's wrong. So I'm just optimistic and hopeful and looking for language on all of these areas, not just mental health, so that we know if we need to push forward on these bills and get support.
Would you go so far, and I think it was Senator Padden, Republican State Senator Padden, who after these bills passed, or maybe around the time of implementation, said they were hostile to law enforcement? Would you go so far as to say that?
I feel like it tied their hands to do their job. So I do feel like they were under attack. And again, I feel like the legislation that came through blanketed all law enforcement. And again, if there's a law enforcement officer breaking the law, we support 100% for them to be held accountable. But what happened was good officers got tied into that, who were doing amazing things, risking their life every single day in what I would argue is the most dangerous job we have. So I do agree that it was unfair to officers and still is until these are fixed.
And Representative Goodman, some of the family members who have organized and coalesced around these reforms, families of individuals who have been killed by police, have said that some departments they thought were weaponizing reform and mocking trauma by politicizing the changes. And so their message was the police departments were overreacting to this and saying they couldn't respond to calls even though that wasn't what the law said. Do you think that there has been some politicization here on the part of police departments?
Well, again, by and large, the police agencies I've talked to are not playing politics with the law here. There have been, unfortunately, some police agencies and police leaders who have tried to score political points on this. That's unfortunate. Blaming one particular party for endangering our neighborhoods and so forth. Representative Mosbrucker and I work very closely, very collaboratively with one another, and our job is to help bring police and the community together. And I think we've done that pretty well over the years. And this raft of legislation we just passed, again, has some ambiguities that we need to fix. I think that it's interesting in the process, although this has been a difficult period since the law went into effect, in the process of looking at how to adjust and refine and clarify the law, police have looked more closely at their jobs, sharpened their focus. They're doing better. Mental health professionals, same thing. They're really looking at what they with the role that they play. Legislators, we have looked at, how we've become better legislators, and then all of us have sort of learned from one another in this process. So I'd say it's sort of an unintended benefit. I mean, it didn't have to be this way, but I think we're going to come out of this much better, where police, mental health professionals, other first responders, and legislators and other civic leaders are all going to be doing a better job, because we've been able to examine what we do, and then we're going to improve the law and clarify the law to reflect that.
I have just a couple minutes left, and I do want to ask about what other changes are on the table for the next session. I know that there's been some talk about the decertification law, possibly or not applying to past misconduct. Melissa Santos at Crosscut did an investigation in August looking at this and reported that this debate has led some state lawmakers to think clarification might be in order. This has also come up in the context of the case involving the Pierce County Sheriff Ed Troyer right now. Briefly on that one, Representative Goodman.
Yeah, I don't know if we need to adjust the law. It's just a question of due process, whether the officer or maybe a law enforcement executive like a sheriff is on notice that the behavior is illegal at the time. And if it is, and if the officer knows that, then the officer can be held liable, even if the law was enacted after the behavior. And so there is a substantive due process concern about going back. It's kind of like an ex post facto law where we can't do that constitutionally, punish someone for what they did before the law went into effect. But if they knew at the time that their conduct was illegal, then they can be held responsible. It's up to the states, up to the Criminal Justice Training Commission, which is the body authorized to investigate and levy sanctions. It's up to them on a case-by-case basis to do it. At the moment, they said they're not going to be going back as much. I'm not sure though if we need to amend the law to make that clear. It really is on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Just looking forward, Representative Mosbrucker, you mentioned that the Senate, House Republicans have some bills ready to go. You're obviously in the minority, so whether you can get traction with those is an open question. But is there one or two that you have top of mind that you would like the majority party to consider?
There's a lot of them, but I think that just really touching on 50 caliber, making sure that we can still project those beanbags as a less lethal use of force, making sure we don't go back in and try to eliminate canines in the state of Washington. That's absolutely 100% important to us, and they serve a great purpose that is less lethal than a weapon, a gun, for example. Mental health is a priority, making sure that we keep people safe at the same time while they're trying to do their jobs. And then vehicle pursuit. We think that you should be able to pursue someone who has murdered someone and not have to see the murder, right? We should be able to work together to make sure that we keep our community safe, de-escalation, reasonable suspicion. Really grateful that we're having discussions saying that we may be able to bring some of that back in certain crimes. And so we just really need that language, or we'll just move forward with a slew of bills to react to all of this to make communities safe based on what we've heard since we left session.
And last question for you, Representative Goodman. I just want to mention, just to prompt you here, there was talk about independent prosecutions, increasing the minimum age to be an officer, requiring community oversight boards for departments with more than 15 officers, and ending qualified immunity. Any of those on the 2022 agenda?
Yeah, I think the independent prosecution proposal where prosecutions of use of deadly force would take place on the state level rather than county by county to get rid of this perceived conflict of interest that prosecutors may have locally. That's a proposal that's one of the priorities in my committee. And then the qualifications for officers, and that's another one coming out of the Senate. I think we're going to go light this year. We need to fix what we did last year, and it's a short session, so not a lot of new proposals. But I can say the independent prosecution proposal is pretty likely. But what Representative Mosbrucker mentioned, as far as mental health response, making sure that less lethal ammunition can be used, this allowing for use of force when there's only reasonable suspicion that serious crimes have been taking place. We are moving forward on that. I think we're going to find more agreement than we think. I hope that we can turn the temperature down and solve these problems and keep communities safe.
Okay. Representatives Goodman and Mosbrucker, I am out of time. I appreciate your time in the conversation, and we will do this again because obviously this is an ongoing topic. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.